Hello and welcome once again to another edition of the Brattlecast. We're talking about books, we're talking about magazines. You'll hear more about that in a second. And we're doing so with the one and only Ken Gloss, the proprietor of the famous Brattle bookshop in Boston on West Street. And you've laid out a series of actually Harper's and Collier's magazine, but they don't look like they just rolled off the newsstand shelves from this year.
Well, the Harper's are what I'm going to talk about mostly, but I'm going to put one personal item on the Collier. But no, well, unless you consider 1911 sort of just rolling off the press.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I do, we deal with older books. And when I first started, 1800s were old. But now you have to stop and think. 1920s is 100 years old.
Yeah, exactly.
But when I was coming to tape this version of the Brattlecast, I was planning on doing it on an old customer of ours, and I will do one on him. But yesterday I was up in New Hampshire, and I got called to a library. They had sent me a few photos and said they had lots of old magazines, and would I be interested? And I said, well, I'll have to come up and look and see them. And what we found is a number of years ago, Life magazine was very common, and people would like it for a few of the covers, maybe as a birthday. But what we found after the pandemic, we put them out on our outside $5 table, and especially people in their teens, 20s, 30s absolutely love them. And so when people call me now on old magazines, it's a little more because I know that people will buy them. But so I was planning on doing a different one, but I started thumbing through before I came here, some of the old magazines, 1911. But what they all had in common in 1911 on the ones I picked were nice color covers, and I'm going to hold the one aside, and they all have automobiles. One is pretty obviously the Grand Canyon.
Right.
Another is a car, looks like it's almost driving through a farm field. Mm-hmm. And another one is some very, very elegantly dressed people.
Top hat and tails. Yes.
Probably in New York, but also the horse and carriages behind. And what I found fascinating by this is obviously the car was just starting to come in. Harper's Weekly was one of the major prominent magazines, weekly magazines in the country, illustrated, but sort of in a way like Life gave you what life was like at the time. Harper's Weekly was giving you life at that time. And you'd look through it, and all of a sudden there were lots of advertisements for automobiles.
Indeed.
And this was before Ford came out with the Model T. And I will just basically tell you, a few of the articles were really interesting. Why do cars cost so much?
Back then.
Back then. And the article went on to explain that, well, they're put together by hand. There's lots of parts. Why does it cost more than a carriage? Well, there's a lot of mechanical parts. And, of course, that's one of the things that Henry Ford realized, that putting these cars together in small lots was very expensive. He really invented the assembly line.
Ken, as you flipped through and opened up a couple of the magazines, I noticed something that you don't see in magazines today. Lots and lots of text.
Yeah.
Very dense text.
There's still advertising,
yep,
but lots of dense text because people read the magazines. You weren't distracted by television. You weren't distracted by radio at that time. But what I found interesting, it was obvious that 1911, the automobile was seen as a major change and the new thing coming on and changing the country. And like I say, they were talking about the cost. But there's an article in one of these magazines about real estate and how the automobile, because people can get around quicker and easier, are moving further out. And the property value is going up.
One thing I noticed, just opened up at a random page, there are car companies that are no longer in existence, needless to say. Speedwell Motor Car, Pope-Hartford. I mean, these are names I never heard of.
Well, quite honestly, I did that, and I looked before, and there was not one ad for one company that I recognized.
Wow.
But this is 1911, so it's very early on in the history of autos and automobiles. and but that's and people were starting to travel, and the railroads had a lot of times. There's one with a beautiful picture. I'm sure this has to be the Grand Canyon. The railroads had been promoting for about 30 or 40 years, traveling out west, traveling the country by rail. Of course, they were trying to promote their business, but now people were having a more individualized way of doing it. And of course, then you needed the infrastructure. It's funny because nowadays you're talking about electric vehicles and you need the infrastructure, you need the charging stations, you need the repair services, you need all of this, and people are realizing that that's coming. Well, people with automobiles, if you were driving in 1911 and you got to some rural area, you didn't call AAA or you didn't have a neighborhood gas station. You maybe had the horse come with and tow you out, but But the other thing about these magazines that I liked is reading about the time, looking at the ads. But if you knew someone who was a car enthusiast, just the beautiful illustrations on the cover would just be a wonderful gift. They sell for $5 or so. They're not high priced. But you sort of bring that history to you.
But by the way, there is one Cadillac limousine. The price, now this is 1911, $3,200. Now that's enormous money back then.
Well, what's a Cadillac now? Almost $100,000.
At least $100,000.
Well,
exactly. So it's all relative.
They're all relative.
But it's a gorgeous ad, and there's a lot of copy. That's why I say the text is very small. People had better eyes then. They ate more carrots. What do you think?
I think they just got a lot written into an ad, and the people who were buying them, sometimes maybe they were buying them or their chauffeur was the one they paid to go out and get the right car for them. And like I say, it was a new industry, and so I am sure they had people, press agents and so on, promoting the fact that the major periodicals would be writing stories about them. But because they were advertising, the magazines also wanted there to be more stories, so there'd be more cars, so there'd be more ads. It worked for everybody.
Interesting note, in the magazine issue I picked up of Harper's, it has a picture of Joseph Pulitzer. Apparently he died in 1911. Harper's Weekly, a journal of civilization. I didn't realize he was the man who put the was he the actual publisher?
No, he wasn't the publisher of Harper's Weekly. He was just a publisher.
Oh, I see. So they gave him an honor.
They gave him an honor there, but it was a weekly. It was like a Life magazine in many ways, and it was fun. But it's when you first see it, and of course the beautiful illustrations. The idea was that you'd see it on the newsstand. The illustration would attract your eye, like nowadays. You'd buy it. You'd read it, you'd get it the next week, or you subscribe. Or in this case, these came from a library. The library had them week to week to week. Now, as I said, these would make great gifts. Now, one of the reasons I brought along a Collier's that also came from the same collection is last night I went out to dinner with a very good friend and her husband, and her husband's a pilot. I mean, he flies for United Airlines or one of the airlines, and the Colliers I picked out was from 1907, had a picture of an airplane, and it says, "When shall we fly?" It's sort of the implication of when people would actually
That was right around the Wright brothers' time, is that?
Right around the Wright brothers. So this is when I selected, next time we go out to dinner with this couple, I'm going to try to surprise them by coming out with a 1907.
If he's an aviator, he would love that. That is really cool.
Yeah, it's so... There are many reasons that people like these old magazines. They just thumb through them. You look at the advertising, you look at the stories, you look at the cover illustrations. And again, they're not necessarily high-priced. They're not necessarily, what you're going to remember 50 years from now that one of the greatest buy. They're just fun.
They are so much fun. And by the way, this Collier's was 10 cents an issue. And if you spend $5.20, you can get a whole year's worth.
Yeah, and it's a little more now.
I think so.
And one of the things I will give credit for I can't tell. I don't know if anyone read these in the library because they're in really, really good condition.
They are very good condition. Yeah, they made just look at the pictures very quickly.
Yeah.
Well, it just goes to show that the history of our world, of our lives, of our country, is not simply written on stock paper in history books, but it's written right here in things like these magazines.
And a lot of times, too, you read through these magazines and you realize what was important then. And even by reading the ads or reading some of the not intended to be top stories, you get much more of a sense of what the people day to day were like and wanting. And then, of course, you also see what the trends were and what companies were trying to promote and where the world was changing.
Great stuff, as always. We're talking, of course, with Ken Gloss, who absolutely just has a high every time he comes in here. And I know that during the day at the store from morning to night, you're having a ball doing this kind of stuff and investigating.
I love it. And one of the things I say when even I start talking about this, if you ask somebody a question who loves what they do, problem isn't getting an answer. It's getting them to stop answering.
Well, we need you to keep talking because it fills up a beautiful podcast called the Brattlecast. Ken, have a wonderful, wonderful day, and thank you for sharing your excitement and enthusiasm for all these great gifts.
I hope I spread it and people come in.